Okay, now that we've got the structures of the outer and middle ear pretty well in hand, let's review and introduce some of the physiologic events that occur in that conductive system, in that outer and middle ear. I know I've mentioned a few of them already. Let me try to kind of tie some of them up now. So we're going to look at the outer ear first, and we're going to start with the statement that the outer ear actually filters sound. That is to say, it's not just a passive mechanism sitting there that gets stimulated and sort of passes into the middle ear exactly what it receives, but rather that outer ear filters the sound. It shapes the sound in some different ways. And we could make some predictions about this kind of sound shaping or spectrum shaping, if you will, when we take a look physically at what the outer ear consists of. So as we see here, it's going to act essentially as a high-pass filter or a high-frequency amplifier, and it seems to be most effective in that regard at passing energy 1500 hertz or above, and in doing so, the outer ear actually physically contributes to our ability to localize sound as well as to extract speech signals from background noises or just the sounds of speech, the phonemes of speech that contribute substantially to recognition. We also wanted to recognize that that outer ear canal is protected in many ways by the production of earwax or cerumen, which is produced in what are known as sebaceous glands that sit in the cartilaginous portion of the outer ear canal. So here again is a diagram of the outer ear canal, or I'm sorry, of the peripheral auditory system. We're going to focus in right here for now on that outer ear. Again, here's the pinna. This gray stuff is cartilage, the yellow is fat, and this brown area here is bony tissue. The sebaceous glands, or the wax-producing glands, would be located out here in the cartilaginous portion of the canal. We would also want to recognize that this ear canal is a small column of air, a small volume of air, and as such, it's going to resonate when it is set into motion or when it is stimulated. It's going to resonate at a relatively high frequency, and it is because of this small mass of air and a very stiff mass of air, very stiff column of air, that the resonance characteristics will be consistent with what we would expect from a system that has low mass and high stiffness, and that is to say the resonance frequency will be relatively high. We can actually graph this on what's known as a transfer function. Sometimes it's called a filter function. It can also be called a frequency response. What we're looking at here is a graph of the effect of the outer ear on a sound. To get this graph, the investigators put a microphone right here at the outside of the ear canal, and they put another microphone in here right near the eardrum. How they did this is actually much simpler than it sounds, and there are a variety of probe microphone assemblies that can do that. If you're interested in that, I would suggest audiology as a course of graduate study. But in any event, if we put a microphone here, and we put another microphone here, and we put a sound in here, through air conduction, then if there's a difference between what this microphone here picks up and what this microphone here picks up, if there's a difference between those two readings, then this system must somehow be modifying the sound that has come in from the environment. And that's what we're going to look at here. So the sound that goes into the ear is essentially a white noise. That is to say, it's got equal energy at all these different frequencies from 200 out to 10,000 hertz or more. And at the opening to the ear canal, that is to say right there, the sound spectrum looks like this. In other words, it's flat. Now, if this is what was picked up by the microphone here, then we would know that the outer ear was having no effect on that sound. And in fact, if we took those two microphones and moved them away from the head, put one over here and one over here, and presented that same sound, you better believe you would see that same spectrum. In other words, the same distribution of energy across frequency at both microphones here and here. But when we do this experiment with a human ear and have the microphones placed as I just indicated, what goes into the ear is not what appears at the eardrum. In fact, at the eardrum, there is a lot more energy present at the high frequencies. This frequency range from about 1500 out to close to 8000 hertz. A lot more energy at the eardrum than there was at the opening to the ear. That is to say, the energy here far exceeds the amount of energy here. And that is due to the resonance characteristics of this outer ear. And again, we'd predict that given the size and the volume of air and the stiffness of that air in the external canal, we would anticipate something like this because we know that that system is going to resonate, that is to say, favor the vibration of air particles at higher frequencies. And remember, all of these frequencies are contained in that sound. It turns out that it's only these frequencies that really get amplified. Again, those are relatively high frequencies, and it is the physical characteristics of the eardrum and the ear canal that reinforce the energy at those frequencies, making the outer ear actually act like an acoustic filter, or almost some kind of acoustic amplifier. Well, we mentioned last time also the Eustachian tube, which is responsible for aerating the middle ear space. That is to say, keeping the middle ear space air pressure as close to possible as the air pressure in the atmosphere. And you'll recall that I mentioned last time that the Eustachian tube really does provide the only pathway for air to enter that middle ear. We will see in a few minutes how a Eustachian tube dysfunction can occur and how and why it is more common in small children than it is in adults. The main reason that the air pressure on both sides of the eardrum the air pressures on both sides have to be equalized is because it will be at those equalized air pressures that the eardrum vibrates most effectively. So what I'm saying basically here is the air pressure out here in the atmosphere should be very close to the air pressure here in the middle ear space, and it's going to be up to this tube, the Eustachian tube, to allow air to flow into this space from the atmosphere in order to equalize these pressures. When the air pressure on both sides of the eardrum are relatively similar, the eardrum will vibrate most freely. If the air pressure out here, for example, is much higher than the air pressure in here, then the eardrum will actually be pushed in toward the center of your head even when it is at rest, and it will not vibrate as freely as it should. Excuse me. So we were there. Now let me skip ahead one slide to here. You'll recall that I also had mentioned that there is a great deal of sound energy that is reflected off of or lost when the airborne sound signal reaches the fluid-filled medium of the inner ear or the cochlea. And that is kind of very simply indicated here. You got air in the outside, you got fluids on the inside. The impedance of the flow to energy here is much lower than it is here, and it is at that interface between the fluids of the cochlea, which are right behind this stapes footplate, and the actual footplate itself. It is right at that interface where the vast majority of the energy is reflected off of the cochlea, and that is going to be a problem for the mammalian listener who lives on land, because the the loss of energy is going to need to somehow be made up by that middle ear system. And indeed, that's the main function of the middle ear, to serve as a mechanical amplifier to overcome the loss of energy owing to the reflection of sound energy from the cochlea, the fluids of the cochlea. I might have mentioned this earlier, but just in case I didn't, it's kind of interesting to note, this 99.9%, what that really means is that for every 1,000 units of sound power that is put into the middle ear system, only 1 unit would make it into the cochlea through that interface between the stapes footplate and the fluids of the cochlea. Only 1 unit out of 1,000 would make it through there were it not for the middle ear serving as this mechanical amplifier. By comparison, if you were to shine a light on a mirror, now you know that a mirror is pretty good at reflecting light energy, correct? But it turns out that the fluids of the cochlea actually reflect a greater proportion of sound energy than a mirror reflects light energy. That is to say, a mirror absorbs more light per unit put in to that mirror or that system than the cochlea absorbs sound energy without the mechanical amplification of the middle ear. So it's a pretty remarkable thing that this middle ear has to do to be able to overcome that phenomenal loss of energy or due to reflection by the cochlear fluids. So again, we're talking about this system right here providing substantial mechanical amplification in order to drive that stapes footplate into the cochlea, and in doing so stimulate the cochlea and the organ of hearing in order to provide the audible sensation. Here's how the middle ear does it, without going into too much detail, because this does get into some kind of interesting math that I would save for those of you interested in going on to study audiology as a grad student. Just recognize there are a couple of simple ways, though, that this happens. One is this so-called surface area ratio. So the eardrum has a relatively large surface area compared to that of the stapes footplate. You can think of this in the following way. All of the energy that displaces the eardrum, all of the sound energy that pushes on that eardrum is collected along this large surface area, and it is focused through the movement of the ossicles onto this very small surface area. Now, think of putting a thumbtack into a surface. You could do it one of two ways. You can face the broad circle part of the thumbtack against your thumb and press the skinny, sharp part into the wall, or you could flip it around and try to press the sharp part and drive the fat part into the wall, and obviously one way is easier than the other. And your ear kind of takes advantage of that same surface area ratio to drive the stapes footplate, almost like it was the sharp end of a thumbtack, into the cochlea when the eardrum is moved back and forth. So that focusing of energy from a large surface area to a small surface area, that focusing of sound pressure, is one of the major ways that the middle ear system mechanically works to overcome that impedance mismatch or that loss of energy. Another way that it does that is through this lever action, wherein these two bones, the malleus and the incus, actually vibrate against one another in a lever-like fashion and mechanically increase the pressure being delivered to the stapes footplate that way. Now that is present all the time that you're hearing a sound, but it's a much less prominent effect. It produces much less energy, if you will, or increases the pressure much less than the surface area advantage I just mentioned. This surface area difference is really the big player here. And then there's also this buckling action of the eardrum, which just relates to the mode of vibration undertaken by the eardrum. It actually accelerates the delivery of the pressure wave to the cochlea and amplifies it consequently, doubling the sound pressure at the stapes footplate, which also is helpful at recovering some of the energy. Again, not as much as we see with the surface area advantage of the eardrum to the stapes footplate, but through the lever action and this buckling or this unusual motion of the eardrum, the amount of energy delivered to the stapes footplate relative to what was delivered to the eardrum is amplified considerably. So here we are kind of summarizing those last two ideas. Keep in mind also that this ossicular chain, that is to say the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, selectively stimulate the oval window. That is to say they don't lose any energy along the way. This chain of bones is very good at delivering all the energy that has hit the eardrum directly onto that space. So there's very little energy lost to the surrounding areas or the surrounding tissue. And that is what makes up for the rest of the energy that would have been lost at the cochlear fluid. So in summary here, the middle ear mechanical action recovers just about all the energy that would have been lost given the fact that we are trying to send from the atmosphere a sound into a fluid-filled space. Ultimately, what we will see when we talk about the cochlea is that the cochlea is a hydraulic system. And so we're taking this airborne energy and making it operate what is basically a hydraulic system. And to do that, we have to increase its pressure, we have to increase its power dramatically. The middle ear accomplishes that amplification, and it does so mechanically using these very simple mechanical tricks: surface area advantage, lever advantage, mode of vibration, that buckling action of the eardrum. If we now do the same kind of thing with the middle ear that we did with the outer ear, and that is to say, place an accelerometer or some kind of measurement device here and provide another one here, we can determine what the middle ear system is doing to the sound delivered to the eardrum. And again, there would be the input sound. It's again a white noise, energy equally distributed across frequency. And look what comes out at the interface with the cochlea. There is quite a substantial increase in the amount of energy associated with the delivery of that sound. Specifically, the mechanical advantage operates again in generally a higher frequency range. The effect seems to be greatest from about 400, 500 hertz all the way out to about 7,000 or 8,000 hertz. And again, that would suggest that what we're looking at is a very stiff system, right? Because it's primarily the high frequency energy that is getting amplified. And the middle ear system, as you would expect, is very low mass. Recall how small those bones were when compared to a penny in the previous set of lectures. And they are also, as I indicated previously, tightly coupled through ligaments to the walls of the middle ear space. So it's a very stiff system. And as we would expect, the bulk of the amplification occurs here at frequencies that are quite a bit, that are on the high side, I guess we would say. So this system is what's going to help recover, and here's the influence of the recovery, if you will, or the influence of the amplification. Most of the sound that would otherwise be lost to the reflection of sound energy from the cochlea. The middle ear also has a protective circuit built into it, and we can think of this as a reflexive contraction of those two middle ear muscles that we talked about last time, the stapedius muscle and the tensor tympani. This says stapes muscle. That's wrong. It should say stapedius. That's my mistake. And the stapedius muscle is considered the primary effector of the reflex because it is only activated by acoustic stimuli. The tensor tympani muscle, as I again suggested last time, can be stimulated and will contract in response to a variety of stimulation that has either little to do with sound or even nothing to do with sound. The effect of the muscle contraction is that the stapes footplate will be tightened, its range of motion will be reduced, in the oval window. That means that no matter how hard a sound is pushing on the eardrum, that energy will not be effectively delivered through the oval window to the cochlea. That's good if the sound is of a very high magnitude, and of course it takes a sound of a high magnitude to stimulate the reflex, because in that way the acoustic reflex has a protective nature with respect to the delivery of sound to the cochlea. When sounds are very loud, we don't want them making it into the cochlea because once in the cochlea, they can damage some of the sensory structures that are inside of it. So this acoustic reflex facilitates the protection of that delicate inner ear structure by actually restricting the amount of motion that the acicular chain will experience when when the individual is stimulated with a high level sound. With respect to the Eustachian tube, I talked about this last time also, as it will open usually passively as a byproduct of swallowing or yawning or chewing or moving your head around or moving your jaw around. The problem is that if the Eustachian tube does not function properly, if it doesn't open routinely, then the middle ear air pressure may change with respect to the atmospheric air pressure. Specifically, the tissues of the middle ear space will absorb some of the air that would otherwise be in the middle ear, and the air pressure in the middle ear will drop relative to what the air pressure is in the atmosphere. If that air is not replenished through the activity of the Eustachian tube, then the listener may notice that their hearing seems to decrease for a little while. This would be similar to the effect of, let's say, driving up over the mountain to Asheville or something, or going up in an airplane, and you know how your ears pop when you do something like that, and all of a sudden you realize, gosh, I can hear much better than I was able to hear just a moment ago. That popping is actually the result of air, your Eustachian tube opening, air rushing back up into this space, equalizing the air pressure on both sides of the eardrum, and the eardrum goes back to its resting position, and suddenly you can hear better. The actual popping sound that you hear is probably the sound of the mucus-lined cavity of this Eustachian tube opening up momentarily. And then the replenishing of this air allows your eardrum to work more normally, allows it to work the way that it should. If you don't replenish this air, then the hearing eventually does decline because the eardrum is sucked medially toward the center of the head and does not vibrate as well as it should. It's also a precursor, that is to say, Eustachian tube dysfunction is also a precursor to middle ear infection. It is one of the more likely predisposing conditions that will lead to a middle ear infection if it is not corrected. Now, I said before that Eustachian tube dysfunction is more common among children than it is among adults. One of the reasons for this seems to be the Eustachian tube in children is more horizontal than it is in adults. And if you'll recall, this shaded area here, by the way, is that nasopharyngeal region. One thing that I mentioned before is that this tube is lined with mucosal skin, and it is sticky, and it normally is closed. It takes some action on the part of the individual to actually open up the Eustachian tube. Well, the more horizontal it is, the harder it will be to, in a sense, defeat gravity when trying to open this thing up. And so small children, until they get to be about 7 or 8 years of age, who have Eustachian tubes oriented at that angle, tend to have more substantial middle ear problems than adults whose Eustachian tubes seem to be angled a bit more steeply and are, and as a consequence, able to open more routinely. So in summary, the conductive system essentially acoustically filters sound in the outer ear and mechanically amplifies sound in the middle ear. We saw the 3 ways that that happens, and we also recognized that there was built into the middle ear this protective reflex, the so-called acoustic reflex, which reduces sound energy effectively, particularly in low frequencies when the muscles contract. We also had looked at the Eustachian tube, facilitating the aeration or the replacement of air into that middle ear space or the tympanum, which will facilitate eardrum vibration and will even be noticeable to a listener as they go change altitude quickly, as perhaps that popping sound and then followed by the seeming restoration of hearing sensitivity. One last thing to mention here about conductive system function, and that is we want to remember that nothing smaller than the elbow should be put into the ear. So here's somebody who seems to be sticking a Q-tip into their ear canal, and all of this, brownish stuff there is meant to symbolize earwax. And you can see how putting a Q-tip into that ear is essentially going to just pack that earwax in, almost like you were loading an old gunpowder-fired musket or something like that. So we want to make sure that we and our patients understand the potential dangers in shoving that wax deeper and deeper into the ear canal. If it remains close to the outside of the ear canal, it will come out on its own. If it gets packed in there deeper and deeper, it will not come out on its own and it will need to be removed, sometimes through an occasionally painful process called lavage. So let the buyer beware when you're talking about Q-tips and shoving them into your ear canals like this poor person is trying to do.